Hello and welcome to Bipolarcast. This is a podcast where myself and Matt Bazuki speak to people with bipolar disorder using metabolic therapies like a ketogenic diet. Today we're very excited to have Hannah Warren on the podcast, and Hannah has been a great advocate for the bipolar community, sharing her lived experience with ketosis and metabolic therapies, and has really done a huge service to the bipolar community in raising awareness to these issues online and also telling other people about this intervention and seeing them improve. And we're going to hear some about that during this podcast. She's working with Bazuki Group as the Mental Health Communications and Advocacy Manager. And this is such a fantastic role because it's spreading this knowledge we're gaining about ketogenic diet and ketosis on a much wider scale and metabolic therapies more widely. And I know Hannah has gone through a great journey of her own self-discipline and self-development to learn about these metabolic therapies. So I think it's very special and rare to get to speak to people like Hannah who've exerted discipline and educated themselves and learned about their condition enough to be in remission and to be an example to other people. So it's a great honor to have you on the podcast today, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me, Ian. I'm so honored to be here with you both, and I'm a huge fan of your work, and it's been incredible to see how you've been a champion for this movement and really driven the science forward in such incredible ways and establishing this metabolic psychiatry hub. It's just absolutely incredible to see the progress, and I'm really excited just to have an opportunity to catch up with you and share some stories.
So we've met I think first at ISBD, the International Society of Bipolar Disorders in Chicago, and this was a really exciting time because scientists were kind of learning about this for the first time, and we were presenting data from the trials and seeing this kind of spread as a kind of legitimate scientific area of endeavor. And I know you've been on a personal journey with ketosis and bipolar disorder that you're sharing with me about at ISBD. I'd love if you'd like to share a bit about your journey of how you reached ketosis and metabolic therapies and what kind of trials did you go through on the journey to reaching this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I look back on kind of my journey of healing and being able to put my bipolar disorder into remission, it really started well before I knew about ketogenic therapy. In about 2019, I started doing a lot of different metabolic interventions without knowing they could particularly be treatment for my bipolar disorder. So I started with a lot of exercise and meditation, and I discovered fasting, started doing a lot of intermittent and extended fasting. And that's when I started to just see my quality of life really improve. Was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the age of 28, a little more than a decade ago. After that, it was absolutely devastating. Like so many people, I experienced really negative side effects from the medication, especially metabolic harm. I had put on more than 70 pounds, felt really physically unwell. There were times of intense depression, suicidal ideations that really it's quite miraculous that I survived and I made it through those. Otherwise, it was a lot of times where it felt like a complete limbo, where I was just numb and sedated, really didn't have any love for life. It wasn't until I found those different interventions, exercise, meditation, and the fasting, that my life really started to transform for the better. And I started to be able to feel like myself again. But after a period of that, I felt like I was still experiencing side effects from the medication, still being impeded by that, and that I really could go on to heal further. At the time, of course, I knew that there would be a risk in going off my medication, but I was really just thinking, I'm feeling so much better. It had been more than 7 years taking antipsychotics, and I thought I should experiment with going off of these. And of course, that ended up not going well, and I did have a relapse manic episode in 2021. And it was after I got out of the hospital at that point that I finally discovered ketogenic therapy. And at the time, it was just a matter of, after having been off of antipsychotics for about a year, I had really just started to fully reclaim my physical health and started to experience the things that I had loved about life prior to my diagnosis, being very creative and just having a real love for life, a passion for life. I was starting to get that all back and feeling physically well, just felt like myself again. And I thought, I cannot go back on these medications and lose that. And at the time, I didn't know if there were any alternatives out there, but I decided to start searching to see if there was something else that I could try instead of going back on the medication. And that's when I discovered the work of Dr. Christopher Palmer. And reading about it, of course, it was interesting to me that ketogenic therapy worked as a fasting mimicking diet because of the incredible results I had seen while I was fasting. I had always experienced during, especially those extended fasts that I would do a few days to a week, this just heightened clarity and better cognitive functioning, increased energy. So when I saw that connection, it really convinced me right away that, this is something absolutely worth trying. And because I had done so much fasting, I also had the benefit of already being metabolically flexible, meaning my body could easily switch to ketones rather than glucose as a fuel source. So I just started the ketogenic diet and right away saw tremendous benefits. For me, post-mania, right, getting out of the hospital, that's when I'd be hit by that crushing suicidal depression. And in the past, following my previous two episodes, that lasted more than a year. It was incredibly hard to get out of. So when I started doing ketogenic therapy, first of all, my depression never got very severe. I was not suicidal. I was a little depressed and anxious, but even that cleared within a couple months. And it's incredible now, of course, in retrospect, because at the time I was optimistic. I don't think I really thought it would be able to keep me from full-blown mania and keep me out of ever needing to go back to the hospital again. I thought this is something that could help me with my symptoms. Let's see what happens. What I didn't understand at all at the time was the concept of remission and the idea that this was an intervention that could completely transform my life to the extent that I don't even say I have bipolar disorder anymore. That was something I didn't learn to more than a year later after I had been doing ketogenic therapies and Brain Energy was published and I got to connect with Dr. Palmer. And that's when I understood, this isn't just about symptom management. This is about actually treating a root cause and has fundamentally kind of changed my relationship to my illness.
So when you went into ketosis for the first time, what was your experience like compared to when you were going on medications? And the quality of life you're describing it seems like very different to how people are in terms of euthymic on medication. Euthymic on medication is one thing, and what you're describing sounds like how would you compare the two?
Yeah, it absolutely could not be more different. I think in the early stages of the intervention, like I said, it was a couple months that it took to really put the depression into remission and just for me to kind of clear from that and start to feel completely myself again. But after that is when things became really magical. I've talked to other people who have this experience where you get this increase in energy. And of course, with a bipolar disorder diagnosis in that background, that can be a little scary. But it's not always pathological to have an increase in energy, right? With the ketogenic diet, it's that all of a sudden our brain has this more optimal fuel source that we're able to utilize. And so it was actually a good shift for me. I didn't experience any hypomania, but I just got my energy back in a way that I never could on medication. On medication, I always felt pretty dulled and always quite exhausted, get home from work and I just want to crash. I really didn't have any extra energy to pursue creative endeavors or passions. And all of that has changed with ketogenic therapy. I think for me, of course, the benefit of being able to be both physically and mentally well, that was huge, being able to reclaim my physical health, get back in shape and enjoy running and exercise and hiking and just be very active. But on top of that, I think the most amazing benefit for me has been being able to get my creativity back. In the past, I really couldn't do that on medication. I never felt like I could explore the way that I can now again. And for me, I think there was even a fear element whenever I would feel heightened creativity, when I'd want to write poetry or paint. I kind of associated that with starting to tip over into hypomania and mania. So it would scare me when I felt that way. And discovering now that I can have that back was like just the most invaluable gift, because that was something that always enhanced my life and I felt like I had lost. And I will never take it for granted. I mean, it's such a beautiful aspect of life, and being able to embrace that again just feels incredible.
I can relate to that. I get the creativity comes roaring back on keto, especially when you drop some of the meds, and the heavy duty antipsychotics dull that a little bit, or at least it definitely did for me. I remember when I first started the diet and I felt so good and I had so much energy and my sleep was really, really good. but I had periods of time or moments where I felt a little bit paranoid because I felt so good. And it was hard to tease out, at least for the first few months, whether I was just feeling amazing because it was keto or whether I was going manic, and I was paranoid about it. Did you have that experience, or did it last?
Absolutely. And I think
Yeah.
that overall is one of the most ironic things about bipolar disorder. It's such a weird illness to have to be like, I feel too good. This is scary. Like just not being able to enjoy feeling good is something that your average person really can't relate to. So definitely in the initial stages of that, I worried that it was hypomania. I wasn't having other symptoms like you. My sleep was great. I was able to take naps, but I would still have these moments of like creative awe where it was just like completely seeing so much beauty in the world in this overwhelming, moving way. And I was worried. I'm like, is this a symptom? And I'll actually never forget the first time I talked to Dr. Palmer about it and just, asked him, what is this? Do I need to be concerned? Do I need to monitor this? And he said, no, this sounds really healthy. And this is one of the amazing things about this form of treatment is that you get to keep that. That's a part of who you are. That's a positive thing that you can embrace and not something you have to fear. So I think it's absolutely miraculous to be able to get that back and to realize that it's not pathological. It's not a part of the illness. It's a beautiful part of life, right?
It's such a weird thing because with bipolar, you so infrequently hear people getting into remission or fully better that they never struggle with this. But it's almost like a new thing we're learning about is if you experience such an improvement, how do you readapt to normal life? It's your whole life is adapted to this condition and living with it. And now when you experience periods of, complete remission where you don't have these symptoms, it's like, how do you change your life and how do you even begin to live with that? It's really kind of an interesting question. I had the same thing where I didn't know what normal emotions felt like for such a long time that I couldn't understand what they were, like just a normal experience of happiness, going to a barbecue, being able to like have conversations, like things that were impossible months ago, and suddenly being able to do them. You have to relearn almost like a child in some ways, these aspects of life, I spent many years like isolated with bipolar, so I can totally relate to what you're describing. And one thing I want to mention is there's so many people that have used fasting. You mentioned fasting as a kind of way that you first experienced ketosis. And that's obviously been historically down to Hippocrates, but also even in Russia, there's psychiatrists that went and visited asylums where they fasted thousands of patients, and this has been documented, unfortunately not in peer-reviewed journals, but they have been using this in many places in the world for a long time, like fasting as a way into ketosis. So transitioning into the diet, what did this make possible for you in your life? Like you've been writing you're using this creativity to serve the bipolar community and writing amazing blogs for Metabolic Mind. You can find on the Metabolic Mind website on the blog section some of Hannah's writings that are fantastic and really insightful about bipolar disorder. How has that been for you being able to use your creativity and skills again to help other people with bipolar?
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to go back to the first thing you said before I address the second part of the question, which was just about fasting as a form of treatment. It's also really fascinating, and I'd love your view as a scientist in terms of mechanisms and how effective you think fasting could be. Because I think, of course, we know that when you're fasting, you get into that state of autophagy, and mitochondrial biogenesis, mitophagy, really powerful things are happening in the body. I found that, when I would become manic, I would really naturally want to fast and stop eating. And they always had to force me to eat in the hospital, which has always made me wonder kind of what would have happened if my illness had run its course in like a more natural way. Because as you said, fasting could be used as a form of treatment. So I always wondered if I had just been left and allowed myself to fast, like would my body have healed? And of course, it opens up all these existential interesting questions, when you read about biblical fasting in the Bible and people who had visions and then all of a sudden, they fasted for 40 days and they were better. And it makes me think kind of what that experience could have been like. And when you talk about it as a form of treatment, I always wonder, do you think there could be a time where if we really recognize the metabolic root cause of these illnesses, could fasting be used like in an acute setting? Could it be something where someone's having a psychotic episode and they're able to heal through fasting?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it's been used for such a long time for epilepsy, like going way back hundreds of years in history to Hippocrates, people fasting, people that had, they kind of interpreted epilepsy differently back then. Maybe it's, like possession or something. But in any case, they fasted them. And like you say, that's part of the kind of like history of many traditions is using fasting in those circumstances. And then this obviously became prevalent for epilepsy, and now we're seeing it for psychiatric disorders. But I think it's been used in many places in the world, and it's not been recognized how extensively fasting has been used as a way to manage these things. There's one particularly interesting example, which is in the asylums in Russia, that many thousands of patients were fasted, and they documented, and it's very difficult to say, this is not peer reviewed, but there was a psychiatrist from America who went out to learn about this, and he wrote a single report on it in a journal, and he said that there was thousands of patients they were fasting, and about 70% of them were reaching full remission of schizophrenia, which is quite remarkable if that can be corroborated. There's people working on this now to try and understand it. So yeah, I think fasting could be really useful, and I use intermittent fasting alongside ketogenic diet. Is that something you've tried, sort of intermittent fasting as alongside ketogenic diet, or do you use them separately? Or
No, I do intermittent fasting as well, and I still do extended fasting, especially if there's ever a time where, for whatever reason, I don't see it as a symptom of mental illness, but more as just a normal thing that we have periods of anxiety or stress. And for me, fasting can be very helpful when I have kind of extra stress.
Fasting is ancient. I
yeah,
remember there's a story from the Bible of some, I don't remember exactly where it is, but there was some kid who was having seizures and Jesus came and said, just fast, and the seizures went away. I mean, this has been used throughout history in many, many, many cultures.
yeah.
And it sounds like, Hannah, did it put your symptoms into remission? Like, could a fast settle you down from a manic episode before you found keto?
I think what's interesting when I look back on my journey, like for the period that I was doing quite a bit of extended fasting before I discovered ketogenic therapy, the most notable thing to me is that my third episode, after doing that fasting, I still wasn't able to stay off medication. I still ended up having a full-blown manic episode, but it was actually my least severe episode. And that's very atypical from what I've heard. Usually, if you go on and off medication, each consecutive manic episode gets worse. So I thought that was already kind of an indication that I had started a healing process and that the fasting was doing something. What it makes me think about when we talk about fasting in that manic state and how that could help control the manic episode, it's really interesting because you always have people talk about utilizing medication in an acute setting. And of course, I see the benefit from that. Like when you go through a frightening, awful manic episode where you're psychotic, the medication, helps bring you back to reality. So of course, I mean, I still keep olanzapine in my medicine cupboard. I mean, it's almost 3 years now. I haven't had to take it, but I keep it because it's a horrible, scary thing to go through. But I always wonder, could it be used in an acute setting? Because that would have been my preference if it was like we can fast you or you can take medication. So it'll be interesting to see research like that develop and see if that might potentially be a first, line treatment option that people could do even in an acute crisis.
Yeah, I keep olanzapine too on my keychain and everywhere, although I haven't had to take extra in a long time. Um, it would be so fascinating to try to take people who are psychotic or suicidally depressed or whatever happens to be. And it almost seems to me like the psych wards that where we put people, it's pretty much the opposite of the environment you would want people in to heal long term and recover, in that the food is terrible, obviously, and I tell my root beer anecdote pretty frequently, which is illustrative when I was drinking, bottles of root beer that were in the fridge at the psych ward, but also just the environment and the white walls and everyone's crazy. And I remember a period of time where I couldn't even go outside. I was literally stuck in this small section of the psych ward where I couldn't go out even outside during the day, and I was just in there. And I would love to take back the clocks to 2016 when I first went psychotic. And if you could have put me in like a pasture or a forest, I don't know, and fast for 10 days or something, and then just see where my mind would have been at the end of it. Would I have been able to have insight or, enough insight to take on a keto diet or a more long-term solution at that point? There are so many things that could be interesting, but that we're just we're years away from exploring that as a treatment option, unfortunately.
Yeah, I feel what you're saying so deeply because it's really brutal when you're in that manic state. Like for me, that's when I most crave nature. And then all of a sudden you're put in this locked unit. You know, like you, I was in a locked unit for more than a month with no fresh air. And it's also like here you are with symptoms of paranoia. You're literally like locked somewhere and people are like, why do you just keep getting more paranoid? You're not getting better. It's like, well, I think the circumstances here are kind of exacerbating my paranoia just a little bit since you won't let me leave and get any fresh air or anything. I mean, it's just such an awful thing. And I agree, we know how good natural light and nature is for helping with mental illness. So the idea of being able to be somewhere like that would be so much better.
It's interesting to think about the natural environment as well, how our food would be different. Before we had refrigeration and before we had fields of wheat to eat, there would have been natural periods where you would have fasted and gone into ketosis, frequently throughout the year. And we just don't experience that anymore, which is an interesting thing to think about when you got so many people suffering from metabolic syndrome, diabetes. So, I know that you've used ketogenic diet alongside other metabolic therapies as well. What kind of practices do you use synergistically with ketogenic diet to improve metabolism and manage symptoms? What things have you found useful?
So I absolutely love jogging. Jogging is huge for me. Like so many people with bipolar disorder, while I was on medication and really got this diminished quality of life and just had a totally sad outlook on life because of the way that I felt, I started turning to a lot of negative coping strategies. So I was like drinking a lot and smoking and all of that. It's great that eventually I found the will to first quit doing those things. That was really critical. And then of course, replacing those negative coping strategies with more positive ones. So that's what jogging became for me. I really love that jogger's high, just the feeling of being able to get out. And I love going scenic places to jog. I live near a river, so I have a beautiful, river jogging path that I go on regularly. It's a great time to like clear my head and de-stress. So that's a very common practice for me. And then I'm also now at this point, I'm starting to try to integrate more strength training, which I know that is really good for me as well, and also promotes mitochondrial biogenesis. So that's another one. Meditation is a really important kind of staple of my metabolic therapies. And with that, what works so well synergistically is a journaling practice, I think for me, meditation is about being able to ensure that my thoughts are as constructive as possible, just kind of really becoming aware of the thoughts that you have and the ones that hold you back, whereas the ones that help to catalyze your growth, help you move forward. So those two practices are really important to me as well. And Iain, I remembered I actually didn't end up answering the second part of your question about what it's like being able to do, writing and bring that creativity back to my life. And I was thinking about, in terms of my illness trajectory, like before I had my full-blown manic episode, people ask, did you have symptoms of bipolar disorder prior to that? And in retrospect, anything that I had would have been like hypomania that I actually saw as being something that was an asset. It gave me that feeling of limitless energy and focus, and it helped me to do things, that I was pretty successful in as a young person, starting a nonprofit in India and getting us funding and doing, excelling as a student. I had really only seen it as a positive and had no idea that it could tip over into this realm of illness and that I could have a full-blown manic episode. And then, of course, that changed my relationship with so many things after having mania, and it even made me fear my own creativity and my own ability to be a deep thinker. I think one of the other things that I've gotten back over time that's so valuable to me is realizing that none of my thoughts caused my illness. This illness is physiological. It was a metabolic dysfunction. So for a while, because of the way that I started to think when I was hypomanic, tipping into mania, things like being philosophical, being a deep thinker, exploring your creativity, and just kind of pushing the limits on, what you see as the meaning of life. I mean, those really deep things. For a while, I associated that with my illness, and I was literally afraid of my own thoughts. Like I thought my thoughts could drive me insane. It's been very liberating to realize that it was never my thoughts, but it was a physiological problem. And so at this point, I feel like, you talk about, I don't know if you guys have ever heard this term about thwarting hedonic adaptation, but this idea that hedonic adaptation. So this idea that in life, often you're on this hedonic treadmill, and the more you have, the more you want. We have these kind of insatiable desires as humans, and this thing where we're not satisfied with our lives. The idea of thwarting that is like, how do you step back and remember the valuable things you have? How do you experience gratitude? And for me, I feel like I got the most meaningful kind of lesson in hedonic adaptation that anyone could ever get. And basically that was realizing most people don't know what it's like to lose your most invaluable tool, which is your mind. Like, people don't understand what it's like to lose your ability to control your perception and your ability to make informed decisions and, be conscious. And once you lose that and regain it, I feel like you can never go back. You just realize how important that is. So every day it's like a practice for me to just wake up and being like, I am sane, I am in control of my thoughts and behaviors today, and just how I don't want to take that for granted ever. And as I, continue to go on, almost hitting 3 years of being in remission, I still try to make that a daily reminder, just not to take that for granted.
I feel what you're saying so much. I was always, when I was sick and I wasn't hospitalized before I found keto, there were a few years where I was, you could call it euthymic, but just heavily medicated and not psychotic, but also not floridly manic. And I would track my sleep in this spreadsheet meticulously, and I would watch it. And every time it would decrease, usually around March, this time of year, it would go down and down, 6 hours, 5 hours, 4 hours. I would up the olanzapine, get a big sleep. But I was always watching it. I was always paranoid about my sleep. And then I went on keto, and my sleep normalized to the point where if I slept 6 hours, I would just sleep 9 hours the next night. And so even to this day, if I am underslept for whatever reason, but then I get a big sleep and it's 9.5 hours and I see it on my Oura ring, it's like a gift. And I'm just like a deep breath. And I think to myself, oh, this is amazing. I just got a huge sleep. I'm fine. I'm sane. I don't have to worry about this, because if I slept 9.5 hours, there's no way I'm spiraling into a manic episode. So you talk about the hedonic treadmill. Now that's a concept I've heard about before, and working with that and trying to like limit the just external stimuli and novel information is a big part of it for me, but also just, yeah, I mean, I'm sure I have a perspective about sleep and these small things that most people don't have, by virtue of the fact that I lost my mind and I didn't sleep for a long time, and I understand how precious that is.
Hmm.
I'm absolutely like that too. And especially like when you talk about bouts of creative energy and stuff, where I might get into a flow state where I'm more stimulated and I'm writing or working on a piece of art. And then, if I was becoming hypomanic or manic, what would happen is then having trouble settling down and going to sleep. And it's been so great with this form of treatment that I'll get into that state. And then I often find myself a few hours later, I'm just exhausted and extra tired, and I'll get a great night's sleep. And it is such an amazing feeling. I agree with you.
As someone who meditates and reflects about the condition, how do you feel, and you've thought philosophically about life, because bipolar makes you confront these questions quite frequently, especially at a young age when you're not usually engaging with those kind of topics. How has your outlook on life changed? I remember in your last blog that you wrote, you were saying you have this like positive outlook, you're excited about your future and looking forward to it. How does that feel different in ketosis from how you viewed your future before? And how did you kind of tile this into a view of the world? When you're very unwell with bipolar, you have to kind of construct a different way of seeing the world to survive it. And how has that changed for you now that how do you experience life differently and think about it almost philosophically?
Yeah, that's a really complex question, but a really good question. Um, I think one of the most important things, like so many people who've been through this type of experience, there was a period of grief while I was healing, just feeling like I lost such an important chunk of my life, in young adulthood, that I was really stifled. And for a long time, there was a feeling of mourning that loss. But I really feel like at this point, I'm liberated from that and can be very focused on all the incredible things I've gained from this specific journey. Like, not only at this point do I feel like I got back to baseline, like the person I was prior to my illness, but because of what I've learned through it, I've really had post-traumatic growth. What that looks like to me, I mean, say that they developed a pill that could give me all the benefits of meditation and exercise and ketogenic therapy. Well, of course, that's not likely to happen, but even if it did, I think I would definitely opt for the way that I have gone through this form of treatment because it has taught me so much about behavior change strategies and how to be in control of my mindset and my decisions in life that I think is really empowering for the way that I'm going to continue to grow now that I have reclaimed my physical and mental health. And as far as meditation, and I guess the most important thing it's brought to my life, I still don't really have a clear spiritual view on or have discovered the meaning of life outside of just knowing first and foremost, like that I should embrace universal love and then how that's the most powerful force. And it may sound kind of cheesy, but in this field, it's a very real thing for me. And I'm sure both of you can appreciate it. Just when you know that when you're out there supporting others, when you're spreading this message and you see people's lives really transform and they're able to get some of the benefits that we've experienced. I mean, what can be more powerful than being able to give a gift like that to others and help others find this better path, this form of treatment that can be so life enhancing. So I hope that answers your question, but I feel like that's one of those questions I should probably reflect on for the rest of my life.
Yeah, no, it's so, I think it was Carl Jung who said, trees whose branches reach up to heaven, the roots go down to hell. And I think that describes the bipolar mind. It kind of forces you to confront the extremes of life, both the great things about life and the darkest things about life, and it makes you think about life in a different way, in a more in-depth way. And I think it's wonderful how you've channeled that into helping other people and supporting them on their journey now. And I know what you mean. It's like there's something about experiencing bipolar depression and to be so vulnerable and unable to help yourself. You understand when other people are going through that and you instantly sympathize with them because you feel, I know what that's like to be so lost and not able to find any hope in that situation. So it's so satisfying to be able to help other people and to learn about something that works. So when you kind of engage with creativity and ideas and thoughts, how do you find that now as someone who's healthy compared to you used to worry about inducing mania when you were more unwell? Do you find that there's ways, similarly to how you manage depression, you use exercise and metabolic therapies, do you find that these also kind of prevent mania in the same way as they improve depression?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really didn't realize that it could be possible to control mania without antipsychotics. And finding this, that's what's been so incredible is that I don't have to deal with any of the negative side effects of medication. And I know that this form of treatment keeps me stable and keeps me from having a full-blown manic episode and needing to be hospitalized. So absolutely.
This is manic season. This is March Madness right now, March 18th. And this is the time when in previous years I would be taking 20 milligrams of olanzapine or more just to keep myself sane. And the fact that we were in Vegas and I had one, I was a little underslept and then slept 9 hours one night. Even now, I can't believe it. Like this is the fact that I'm able to be on super, super low dose meds, coming off them. And now it's only the withdrawal that I'm dealing with and I'm trying to taper them. I mean, they're not like, I don't need them for mood stabilization. Just from 9 months of being in ketosis, strict ketosis, so having the ketones high and then being probably in and out, mostly in, sometimes out for the last couple of years. This is something that I think unless you've gone through it and you really know what it's like to battle those mood episodes when they just want to come, and now not having it and not thinking about it. And even for me, probably the most astonishing thing is that I don't worry about it anymore. Like the first 2 years of doing keto and being paranoid and still watching my sleep and I'm thinking it was going to come back. And then, my buddy and I did the Argentina trip when I stayed up until 2:30 every night and I had no symptoms. That was last August. I'd been on the diet 2.5 years. And that's when I realized wow, something has profoundly changed. I suspect the only way I could bring it back, I mean, maybe marijuana would bring it back. I don't know, but it's just for people who haven't tried this can be really remarkable. Probably not for everyone. What were some of your tactics? Did you track ketones? Did you look at it? Anything like that?
No, I never took exogenous ketones, just when I first started, it's so wonderful that Metabolic Mind, we have all these resources now for people starting this journey. There was very little out there that I could find in terms of direction. And I never had any kind of help from a metabolic psychiatrist or anyone trained in metabolic therapies when I was starting. So it was all just kind of felt like my own guinea pig trial and error. When I first started, I thought I needed to be like more in therapeutics, higher zones of ketosis, 3 mmol and up. And so that's kind of what I was trying to do, was reach those higher ketone levels when I first started. And I did that through intermittent fasting, usually kind of 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day max, starting to eat later in the day. And I'm vegetarian, dairy-free. So it was a little challenging at first because I felt restricted. But once I found kind of my routine with the combining fasting with the keto diet, and because of the metabolic flexibility, it was pretty easy to maintain that. And then, of course, about a year into my journey is when Brain Energy was published, and when I became a volunteer for Dr. Palmer, and he started to go on his podcast tour. And then I heard him saying, that bipolar schizophrenia, you could shoot for around 1.5, like the kind of lower nutritional ketosis level. And I hadn't realized that before. So at that point, I kind of loosened the reins a little and didn't always try to be so high with my level of ketosis. But yeah, just for me, and also at the time, I guess I would say I didn't have an understanding before Brain Energy came out about kind of metabolic therapies as a whole. I intuitively knew and felt that, things like meditation and exercise were just integral to my mental health, and that I needed to find a way to maintain those routines and added on ketogenic therapy. But I didn't really understand it as a holistic kind of form of treatment like I did later. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I guess I just kind of intuitively knew that. But throughout the whole journey, at the time I was working at a nonprofit hospice as the marketing and development director. So I had a pretty demanding job, but it was so important to me that I had to make sure I adhered to those routines, followed the ketogenic diet very strictly. I mean, especially for that first year, I really didn't waver. Once the first couple months, of course, there were some times that I gave in to just cravings and stuff like that. But once the cravings went away, I really just was very strict about sticking to it for that entire year.
I'm curious I want to get that CKM, continuous ketone monitor, and see if it affects, like meditation affects my ketone levels. I'm so curious about all of these different things. Okay, what is it like doing it as a vegetarian, dairy-free? What do you eat?
Yeah. A lot of vegetables. I make a lot of like creamy dressings, nuts, berries. I do like tofu. I try to steer clear of kind of plant-based meats or like vegan cheese or anything like that. But I also really like spices and flavors and ethnic foods. So I cook a lot of Indian and Thai food, a lot of fried tofu, making sure I get my coconut oil, those kind of fat sources, avocado oil, olive oil. It's been, I did eventually, when I first started, I was fully vegan. And then later I decided to start eating eggs from family farms. And I love eggs. Those are a really good staple and have helped make the diet sustainable for me. So I do eat a lot of eggs. And of course, those allow you to make, on occasion, I'll do some kind of ketogenic baked goods with almond flour and eggs and stuff like that as well. But
What are some, do you have any kind of like keto tips from your time doing keto, like whether with the diet or otherwise, that have really helped you? There's certain things I found really beneficial on my journey, like combining with exercise and combining with circadian rhythm management. Are there any kind of hacks or interesting tips that you could share about what's helped you to do so well with ketogenic diet?
I think intermittent fasting, like restricting meals, is definitely always helpful for getting into a heightened state of ketosis. And then as far as like how metabolic therapies kind of complement and work together, I think one of the most important practices with the meditation and journaling is that those just really help reinforce positive choices and behavior change. So much of like encouraging ourselves to make the behavior changes that we want have to do with the way that we frame it in our minds and the way that we choose to think about things. So I think a big part of it is not just following a ketogenic diet, but how you choose to think about and embrace the foods that you eat. So as you become a more skilled meditator, you can use things like visualization to really control your thoughts and your attitudes. So I think one of the things was just being able to stay really positive, have a positive orientation. So instead of fixating on restriction and things that I couldn't eat, it's like, how do you really savor what you can eat? How do you, being a creative foodie and having fun with flavors and spices and just really indulging in your food and still enjoying it and not having this mindset about restriction, but I think also even a lot of positive reinforcement while you're enjoying food, that not only am I able to savor this delectable meal, but it's medicinal and this is changing my life, and just, having really positive outlook, if that makes sense.
That's awesome. It's like I find, I don't know if you notice as well, but when I'm meditating ketosis, my mind is so much clearer when I'm in ketosis versus otherwise. It's almost to the point where it's very hard to meditate without being in ketosis. Like the mental noise is so loud, but then in ketosis it just quietens down into kind of like and it's really interesting because it has correlates to things that happen in epilepsy in the brain, this like hyperactivity of the brain, and I think that must be going on and generating some of this racing thoughts. So I find that meditation is
Oh,
yes.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just thinking you would love this. I have a friend in India who's a yogi, so when we were talking about fasting and ketogenic therapy, he was like, well, we just accept this as normal in India, that when you have yogis like going into a deep spiritual states, most of them go crazy for a little while and then they just fast until they're able to feel better and control it and deepen their meditation. So again, that's an interesting idea that ketosis can deepen meditation. I haven't really actually thought about that, but
I think for me it gives me a clarity of mind that I don't ever experience otherwise. Like it's just this constant, almost like a TV with the white noise on, and then in ketosis that just kind of calms to nothing, and whatever thoughts are going to be there are there, but without this kind of like hectic back. It's really noticeable for me, and it's one of the things that like if I use MCTOL, for example, I can feel that mental noise just come down by a lot within the space of 30 or 40 minutes. It was one of the first things that convinced me about ketosis, was experiencing that. So it's quite a nice window into the condition, meditating and using that. What do you notice different in meditation? Do you notice a similar dynamic of decreased mental noise or anything different from when you go into ketosis versus out, or is it much the same?
that's fascinating. I've actually never really thought about it, and only now I've started to experiment a little with carb cycling, partially just because of the increased amount of strength training I'm trying to do, but I'm still kind of unsure how I feel about this strategy and whether I'm enjoying it or not, or whether I want to go back to full on ketogenic therapy. I've been kind of going back and forth, but it brings up an interesting point. I'll make sure to kind of observe more like my mentality based on whether or not I'm in ketosis. Because for me, meditation is a daily practice, usually like 20, 30 minutes in the morning. But I've never really thought about like, is being in ketosis, is my meditation different than when I'm not? So it's an intriguing question. I've definitely, I mean, as I said, kind of in Indian culture, the idea that being in a fully fasted state can heighten meditation, that's a very accepted thing. So I've definitely thought about that before, during an extended fast of like 3 days or a week. Definitely I've seen an impact on meditation, but outside of that, I've never really thought about it. So thanks for giving me something to think about and ponder.
I want to dive into the meditation a little bit. Since I started doing this myself a few years ago, it was 3 years ago. It was actually right before I went on keto that I started to have a daily practice. And the practice has evolved from, it's mostly been like similar to you, 15 to 30 minutes seated in the morning. But then I've gotten lazy about it, and I would do like mindful walks, or I would get sunlight in the morning, but just try to practice some mindfulness first thing in the morning. And I've noticed interesting effects on my personality just having done that. And one of the ones that comes to mind is that I have less impulsive behavior. And it's almost like when I have the urge to do something impulsive or act out or behave in a way that's not in alignment with my values, when the thought comes up and I have the urge to do something like have road rage, for example, is one of the ones that comes to mind. I almost like have the thought, and then usually now, most of the time, I would say I catch the thought and I see it there. I'm like, okay, I'm having this urge to do this thing. That's interesting. I can let it pass. I can choose not to act on that, which is a similar action that happens in the practice of meditation, where I've disconnected and have some headspace and some space between my own ego and my thoughts, as it were. Have you noticed any like changes in your temperament, your personality, um, anything like that since you developed this deep meditation practice?
I think you explained that really well. I think for me too, kind of the most critical thing this meditation practice has done for me is made me more aware of recognizing my thoughts. Because I think initially before someone is really into mindfulness or meditation, we often kind of accept any thought that comes into our minds as like we have an ownership over that thought just because it popped into our heads. When in reality, there's a lot of conscious control over what we decide to accept as our thought as something that's constructive and will help us in our life and the kind of person we want to be versus some actual garbage thought that is really just going to impede us. It's not going to be helpful in any way. So I kind of think for me, meditation practice has been like putting a bouncer in my brain to kind of say, this is a thought that I don't want anywhere near me. Like I don't actually believe in this versus thoughts that I think are going to empower me. So and I agree as well that it's also opened up more space in terms of stimulus versus reaction, like that moment where you can pause and reflect and make a conscious decision and not be impulsive. I've seen that as well. Another thing that's quite important to me. So there's two things in my overall meditative practice. I really love pranayama. I don't know if either of you have tried that, but intensive kind of breathing practice. That really helps me because the breaths themselves, and it's hard to explain if you haven't tried it because it's not just like, you hear meditation, focus on your breath in and out. And to me, that was always extremely boring. But pranayama is more that you're breathing in such a way that there's a physiological response. It's really deep, powerful breaths. So it can make you feel a little lightheaded and tingly. But for me, it just really almost like a form of intoxication just helps me to slow down my mind and really is calming for me. And it's also given me that power of just like breathing in my daily life. So when I experience stress, I naturally just start doing the pranayama. And everybody says, if you're stressed, take a breath. But like when you really master that and can feel what a relief it is to take deep breaths, I find that very helpful. And then the other thing, there's times where I do pranayama and I'm doing meditation and I can get into a more transcendental state of mind where it's just more of a feeling of peace and love and not having so many thoughts. But there's also times where my mind is a little more active. And at those times, I guess, anchoring it more into visualization practices has been helpful for me. So that can really help with behavior change and personal growth kind of things as well. Like if you're pushing outside of your comfort zone in a certain way, I guess the saying that like discipline is remembering what you want. So I guess that's how I use my visualization practice a lot is just envisioning what I want out of my life. And that helps inspire me to stick to certain positive choices and behaviors.
So I find meditation so interesting because I think I found it by accident with having depression like this, the racing kind of suicidal type thinking. At some points it would just go on for days and days, and then it would turn into kind of a calm state where I was still seeing that those things were going through my mind, but it was more in a detached way. And I think now I realize that I'm getting to meditation to similar kind of like it's just like the thoughts are still there, but you're not so wrapped up in them. I compare it to like being in the river, being tossed around by this, the waves versus on the shore, kind of looking at them, and they're still there, but you're not kind of being tossed around by them. So I think it's such a useful practice, and I do find it synergistic with a ketogenic diet. So I'd love to hear about what so you're working with Metabolic Mind, writing posts and sharing advocacy and engaging with other people with bipolar disorder. I wondered if you could share a bit about what's happening with, there's a channel called Living Well with Schizophrenia, and you've been interacting and meeting up recently with them. And I wondered if you could share about what's happening there. I think this is a really amazing piece of work and something that's really remarkable to see someone that's been suffering and so credible and such a great advocate for her condition online, meet someone like yourself and Nicole Lauren and discuss ketogenic therapy with them and have such amazing results from it. I wonder if you could share about some of your advocacy work in that area and going forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Lauren Kennedy, who has the channel Living Well with Schizophrenia, I'm so inspired by her. She is such an incredible person and has been doing such important advocacy work for more than 5 years now. So she started this program. She's a few months into this project where she is documenting on YouTube through vlogging and having experts and everything on her channel, her journey of implementing metabolic therapies, including ketogenic therapy, but also the things we've talked about, regulating sleep, giving up drugs and alcohol, exercise. And she's just doing such an amazing job with the content that she's creating as part of this project. Her videos are so entertaining and informative. They'll really draw you in, but she does it in such a practical way, kind of going over simple things like the staples that she eats, as well as how she's measuring her ketone level, just really making it accessible for so many people. It's cool to see all of the comments as well on her channel from people who are just inspired to try this form of treatment after watching her videos. It's really phenomenal to see how she's inspiring people. And, when you look back at some of her older videos and see the difficulties of her journey, it's impressive to me how open she was when she was struggling so deeply. I mean, for me, I've only been open about my illness for, a couple years now, but she's been doing that for more than 5 years and sharing the deepest, darkest, hardest times, but still building community. And even though she's only a couple of months into her journey with ketogenic therapy now, like she's really feeling like her illness is in remission. She's no longer having symptoms. It's incredibly powerful to see that evolution in real time. I think her project is just such a wonderful resource for so many people.
It's really exciting seeing patients do this advocacy work and sharing their condition. I don't think this has ever happened before, where so many people have come forward about an intervention that's helping them and giving them hope in their life. And that it was amazing seeing that video with her husband as well, where he's obviously overjoyed about this because she's feeling better. What are you excited about in the future of your advocacy work and engaging with people with bipolar disorder about metabolic therapies?
Well, and I'd love your thoughts on this, Ian, because I think one of the things that I struggle with the most at this point is just because the science and the research is ongoing, there's still a lot of questions about like what percentage of people are likely to respond to ketogenic therapy versus who's going to be a non-responder, trying to understand the mechanisms better to be able to target, why is this intervention so incredibly powerful and transformative for some people, and trying to get a better grasp on that. So I think emotionally sometimes I struggle a little that I want to spread hope, without also giving false hope, because a lot of those questions haven't been answered yet. But I think one of the things that stands front and center to me that I'm devoted to is like, even if ketogenic therapy, I'm not going to even try to give an arbitrary number of what percentage of people it would help, but say it only helps X percentage of people, we know that. At the same time, I feel like should be a powerful force for a movement for precision psychiatry. Even if ketogenic therapy is not the answer for a large percentage of people, what it does highlight is that we need better solutions. We shouldn't have given up and just written people off with arbitrary DSM-5 diagnoses. Like, there is a root cause. Something is physiologically going wrong for these, millions of people who are suffering. Some of them have treatment-resistant illnesses or are supposed to accept these terrible diminished quality of life. We need to do better. And I feel like even if ketogenic therapy isn't the answer for everyone, it should highlight that we need to search harder for real solutions. So I hope as a patient advocate, that's one of the powerful messages that I want to make sure that I continue to share, is that we need to do better for people. And, science needs to pave the way to effective forms of treatment.
I'm sure you probably feel the same, but if it works for 1% of people, I will spend the rest of my life helping those 1% of people, and I'm totally dedicated to that. But I think there's very good indications that it'll help many more than that. And I think it's because it's linked to this wider metabolic syndrome epidemic we're experiencing. And this is one of the expressions in the brain. And there's many hundreds of millions of people with diabetes and heart disease and cancers that are driven by this metabolic dysfunction. And I think in the same way, it's just been under-recognized that there's many people with mental illnesses that have driven by this metabolic dysfunction. So, I'm greatly hopeful that this will be something that helps many, many people and many millions of people. And that's why we do this research. But I'm sure you feel the same way, that I'm dedicated to it for whatever number of people like yourself it can help to have better quality of life. And it's always makes it worth it to me speaking to people like you that are doing really well, thriving, expressing themselves in the world, and setting a great example for other people with bipolar. So it really makes it worth it having conversations like this and hearing people doing really well. So I want to thank you for all your amazing advocacy work, for being such a great example of someone living healthy and stable and contributing to the world in such amazing ways. And I'm really excited for the future of what you do for the bipolar community. So thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, guys. And, with that thought, about this form of treatment, I would also say, even if at the time I started, I had been told this would only help 5% of people, I absolutely would have tried it because of the potential upside being so strong. So again, just spreading this word to however many people it could possibly help is so worth it. So thank you guys for the incredible advocacy work you do and for this podcast. It was such a great thing to be here with you both.